Today we're at Knox Farm State Park. It's in the western New York region, East Aurora, just on the edge of town. East Aurora, small town in New York State, about a half an hour south of Buffalo, if you're not familiar with the area. Beautiful state park. It used to be the home to the Knox family. And the Knox family, for those who are not familiar, they are previous owners of the Buffalo Sabres, the NHL hockey team. I say previous because they are no longer owners of it. And they also founded a department store, Woolworths. And so I believe it was Woolworths. I'd have to look that up. But the family has moved on, and they decided to take their property, the old farm here, and they donated it to the state. So the state turned it into a park. And more recently, they took part of the park and made it into a dog park for people to bring their dogs and let them stretch their legs. Every once in a while you will see dogs on the trails too, but the trails are mostly for people and horses. They do have stables here at the park. So there are horses. But I think I've only run into a horse once while I've been on these trails here. That's Knox Farm. It's mostly open field. As I'm looking around, there's mostly open field. Got a crow there, blue jay calling. Mostly open field, but there is quite a bit of woods too. So it's kind of a mixed habitats. The open field, though, is great. This is a great place to come in the spring and summer for birding. You can actually see quite a few field species in the woods here. In the fields here. You can see quite a few species in the woods as well. But a lot of the field species, great habitat for them. And they actually had, I don't know what happened to them all, but they had a bunch of bluebird boxes along some of the trails in the fields. And you see bluebirds all the time, but the bluebird boxes deteriorated, started falling apart, and apparently no one maintained them, so they slowly disappeared, which is a shame. It's a real shame because this is great habitat for the bluebirds. There are still some bluebird boxes up. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're not all gone, but a lot of them have disappeared over the years. But anyhow, we are here at Knox Farm today, and I'd like to get started with our topic for the day: trees and tree ID. Now wait a minute, it's winter time here. the northeastern part of the U.S. here, the trees are already in their dormant state. They're not covered in nice green leaves. Instead, they are just branches. Yeah, they're basically sleeping. So the trees go dormant in the northeastern U.S. and pretty much all northern climates. All the leaves fall off of the deciduous trees. And so it's not a great time to identify trees, or is it? Well, actually, it's a little more challenging, but it can be done. I mean, you just need to know a few tricks of the trade. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail with this because there is so much to talk about, and we'd have to do lots of episodes. And I always try to keep my episodes around 30 minutes because I don't want to go too long with you. But the basics of tree ID. Okay, there's two main groups of trees. There's the deciduous trees, and then there's the conifers, the cone-bearing trees. So those are the two main families. And I'm actually in the woods here at Knox Farm right now, and I am looking around at the many varieties of trees, but there's one thing I'm not seeing much of, and that's the conifers. So deciduous trees, those are the trees that have leaves, what we consider, to be a leaf. They're broad leaves. They basically die off in the winter time, and then in the spring they grow back up, and then you have these beautiful green, energy-producing leaves on the trees. And the other type of tree, cone-bearing conifers, those are the ones that have a modified leaf, or what we like to call needles. So cone-bearing conifers, leaves, go with deciduous. Okay, so that's the two basic main families. Like I said, I'm going to keep this as simple as possible. So let's talk first, since we're in a primarily deciduous forest. I'm looking around, I see one conifer in here. The rest of the trees are deciduous, so they're leaf bearing. All the trees are bare right now. Now, the easiest way to decide what type of tree it is looking at the ground and seeing what leaves are on the ground. That's where they all fell to. But right now, if I look at the ground, I'm seeing so many different types of leaves all mixed in together. That's not going to help me at all. So we have to look at some other clues that'll actually help us to figure out what type of trees these are. And the first one that I always like to use, first clue I always like to use in the winter time, and I do this in the summer as well, but summertime is so much easier. You just look at the leaf and you can usually identify it that way. But in the winter time, when the leaves are not on the trees, that's when you have to pull some of the tricks out of the bag and try to figure it out by narrowing it down with clues and hints. So, looking around, first thing I want to look at is the branches. Okay, and how the trees branch out. Now, you have to be real careful with this, because we get wind, we get animals, we get things damaging the trees. I get people looking at a tree and they're like, okay, well, this is opposite branching. I'll explain opposite in a minute, but what they don't realize is, maybe an animal came along and knocked one of the branches off, and it does. So anyhow, you have to be careful. I usually like to look towards the top of the tree, and I look at the branches up there and how the smaller branches are coming out of some of the larger branches. Now, there's two types. There's either opposite or there's alternative. Okay, so if the branches are coming out from the larger branch across from each other, directly across from each other, that is opposite branching. If you have a branch coming out from either side of a larger branch or from the trunk that are not coming out directly across from each other, okay, that is not opposite, which means that's alternative. Okay, so those are the two main types of branching that we have. And that will show us, well, I shouldn't say it'll show us, it'll narrow it down to certain trees. I always like to think madcap horse. And you're like, what on earth are you talking about? Okay, madcap horse. The mad. Maple, ash, dogwood. Okay, so M-A-D. Mad. Maple, ash, and dogwood. Those are three of the trees that have opposite branching. Okay, so what's the cap horse? Caprifoliacea. It's a, sorry for getting into the Latin names here. It's a family of trees, including some bushes as well. If you can remember the mad part, you're pretty set. But there's also the horse chestnut. So maple, ash, dogwood, horse chestnut, and Caprifoliacea family. Those are the trees that have opposite branching. So if you see a tree that has opposite branching, it's one of those. Okay, it could be any type of maple, but it's going to be one of those trees. If it has alternate branching, you still narrowed it down. There's still a lot of trees that have alternate branching, but you know it's not going to be a maple, it's not going to be an ash, so you can just toss those right out the window. So that's the first way I narrow it down. Another thing you can do when you're trying to identify trees in the winter is you're looking at the bark. Okay, the bark is going to be different. And I'm not going to describe every single type of bark. We'll be here for weeks talking about that. My suggestion is to get an awesome tree field guide. Audubon makes some good ones. Peterson makes a good tree field guide. There's a lot of them out there. I don't know if there's any apps that have trees on them, but I'm sure there are. You can get a good field guide, look at the bark. It's going to help you. Now, these field guides will have the trees when they're alive and in bloom, so with all the green on them. So be careful. Don't try to look at the leaves. Once again, I'm looking at the ground right now, and I'm seeing some red oak. I'm seeing some ash, I'm seeing some maple, I'm seeing a lot of different leaves here on the ground, so don't depend on that. But at least you have it narrowed down to your madcap horse or not madcap horse. Now, so we are looking at bark. Now, there are some telltale trees out there that the bark will really let you know what you're seeing. Okay, for instance, right now I'm in an area and there's like probably about 7 or 8 trees. Next time I'm looking in the distance, I can tell too. There's a lot more over there that have the same bark. It almost looks like it's kind of a grayish brown bark, and they look like burnt potato chips. The bark actually looks like burnt potato chips. It's almost scaly. Now, this is what we call a cherry tree. Okay, it's a black cherry. Black cherry always has the potato chip type of bark on it. Now, cherry trees, if you want to, double check yourself, I'm looking up, I'm looking at the branching, And sure enough, it is alternative branching. Yes, because remember, it didn't fit into our madcap horse. So the cherry tree has that very distinctive bark. Another tree that we have in this area that has a very distinctive bark to it. It almost looks like an elephant's leg. Very gray in color, very smooth. It does have some striping on it, some scarring I should call it. I don't want you to think that it looks like a skunk. It doesn't. It's very gray in color. It almost looks like a large elephant's leg. If we look up once again, you will know that it is alternative branching. Once again, careful with alternative branching because maybe a branch got broken off in a windstorm or something. This is an elm tree. Okay, so the elm trees have that very distinctive grayish looking bark to them. Another thing I do want to caution you about bark is that when you're looking at the bark of a tree, think about the size of the tree. Okay, think about the age. There's a big tree in front of me I want to talk about in a second, but think about the age of the tree because a younger maple will look a lot different than an older maple. As they get older, I have found a lot of trees will start getting more deeper grooves in them. Okay, so they look rougher. And speaking of a rougher looking tree, I've got a tree right in front of me, a very distinctive bark. It looks like the bark is peeling off of it. I am going to be taking pictures along the way, just that I can post these on our Patreon so that you can see some of these barks. I'll also put it in the notes. But this tree here, it looks like the bark is actually just peeling right off. It's coming off, but it's very gray in color. There are other trees that do this as well. There's this one here is what we call a shagbark hickory. There's a couple of young ones around it too. This is quite an old tree here. Now, determining age of tree is a little bit tough sometimes because don't go by how thick it is. The tree that's growing out in the open will grow thicker than the tree that's been contained in the woods, that's struggling to just grow up above the other trees, that it can get way up to the sunlight, so that it can, get that whole photosynthesis energy thing going. So don't let it fool you if you see a really thick tree and you think, oh, that's an old tree, and then you see a very thin tree and you think, oh, that's a young tree. No, it's not true. The thin tree could be just as old as the thick one. Just depends on where it's growing, the habitat it's in, the soil, how much water it gets. Some trees take a longer time to grow because of this. Now, there are some trees that are a little bit more difficult to figure out the bark. Their bark looks very similar. I mean, maples are one of those that I've gotten used to deciphering. Is that a maple? Is it not a maple? But the bark can fool you on maples by age, but there are some other look-alike trees that have very similar bark to them. One of my favorite trees, and I'm not seeing any in this part of the woods here, but we do have quite a few of them around western New York here. One of my favorites is the sycamore. Okay, sycamore, look at me all covered and sore. If I don't get better soon, I'll be sick more. Okay, a little rhyme I learned many years ago. Helps me remember what the bark looks like. Almost looks like it's a sick tree. It's got all these patches on it. It's patchy greenish and white. So you get a lot of coloration in it, but it's a very distinctive tree when you see it. There's another one called the London Plains tree, which is in the same family, and they have been introduced into the U.S. So that's another tree that looks very similar to it, but it has more of a greenish hue to it, the London Plains. So look at the bark, get a good field guide. I'm not going to go through the woods describing every single tree in here. And it's actually, I'm seeing mostly maples in this section. The shagbark hickory, there's another really large, older shagbark here. And I'm seeing a lot of cherry. I'm seeing the elm. So that's the main trees that I am seeing in this area. And I'm going to keep walking, so we'll head into another section of the woods and we'll see what we can find there. Now, another thing that can give trees away is sometimes you still have leaves hanging off the tree. So they don't quite fall to the ground yet. They're hanging on for dear life until the spring comes along, and you can use that to identify the tree as well. Now, if you do have, for instance, oak trees, I have some oak trees that hang on to some of their leaves throughout the winter. That'll help you to determine, what type of oak it is. I'm seeing actually right here on the ground, there's a tree here that's an oak. And, got another species here I'll talk about in a second. There's several oak leaves on the ground, and I'm only seeing one tree here that looks like an oak by the bark. So I'm looking at the leaf on the ground, and it's got very thin lobes to it. So this tells me this is a pin oak. So once you have it narrowed down to that's the only oak tree I see here, it's got to be some sort of oak, you can start looking at the ground. Now, I have another tree here as I was walking out of the woods. I have a short field to cross here, and I'll go back into another section of the woods which has more conifers. This one here, it looks like it's got all these stripes going across it. This on the bottom, you can tell it's got a little bit of white on it. As you go up, there's a little bit more white towards the top. This is a birch tree. It's a white birch. There are several types of birch trees around, but I can tell by the bark it's a birch tree. And you'll often find with some birch trees, especially after they've died and fallen to the ground, the inside will rot, the bark will actually stay much longer in its circle, even after the inside has rotted away. And one of the reasons is because the bark contains oils in it. And those oils will actually help to preserve the bark much longer. So that is a birch tree. Now I'm crossing over a small field. We're headed towards another section of woods with more conifers in it. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit more about the deciduous trees, other methods that I use to identify them in the winter time. One is just structure. Okay, the structure, the branching, the way the tree looks, the shape of it. Okay, so that's what I mean by structure. Some trees, like one I'm looking at right in front of me, this one's really tall, but the branching, it doesn't have a lot of little branches. It's almost like it goes from the trunk to a branch coming off, and off of that branch is one branch, or I shouldn't say one branch, but it has branches coming off of that one branch, and then you have just really short, thick branches coming off of that. Okay, that's an ash tree. It's one way that I remember, this is just my own clue. You can come up with your own little sayings. It often helps to identify things, whether it's trees or birds, or come up with your own little saying to, there goes a squirrel. It helps me to remember, it's like, what was that tree? What was that? I've gotten to the point where I can recognize most of them, but every once in a while I'll have some problems remembering. It's the age thing, what tree it was. But I always try to think, always sunny here. Okay, always sunny here. Those thick branches, and not a lot of them, is letting the sun through. Okay, so it's letting the sun come through to the ground. Always sunny here. ASH. Ash. Okay, that's just my little trick to remember the ash tree. There's other little things that you can look at. The shape of the crown of the tree. I mean, a maple tree has a very distinctive shape to it when you're looking at it from a distance. Unless there's been damage to it, then it can change its shape. Some trees will hang on to their leaves a little bit longer. And those, like this ash tree I'm walking past right now, I don't know if you can hear all the leaves rustling in the wind. Okay. No one really knows why, but scientists assume that it's because the tree wants to hang on to those leaves through the winter, so that in the spring, when they fall to the ground, they fall to the ground right underneath the tree and help to add fertilizer to the ground. Now, another thing you want to look at is you want to look, when you're looking at structures, does it have a lot of, tiny little branching coming off, Usually that is a fruit-bearing tree, and sometimes you'll actually see some of the old fruit on the tree still. For instance, an apple tree, black cherry often, I'll see some fruit left over from the summertime, just some dried up, shriveled fruit there. Apple trees, different types of apple trees, crab apple, regular apple trees. I often find fruit still on the tree, and so you can tell what type of tree it is. So look for fruit, look at the bark, look at the branching, look at all these different things, and then welcome back, friends. It's good to be inside where it's nice and warm, although it was a really nice hike. I hope you enjoyed walking through Knox Farm State Park, identifying trees. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, it got way too long, this episode, so I did cut it in half. We'll talk a little bit about the coniferous trees next week. So please be sure to join me and bring along some friends. The more people that share this podcast, listen to this podcast, the more people who will learn to appreciate nature, and that means all those people will love to take care of the nature in their own backyards, around them. So please share the episode. It also helps me out if you download, rate it, review it. And if you have any questions, if you ever have any questions about what I'm talking about, or questions about nature in general, or if you have ideas for future episodes you'd like to learn about, send me a message. You can either do it through my website, or you can do it through my Instagram page. What do you mean you're not following my Instagram page? What's the problem? What are you waiting for? Yeah, my Instagram page is the_nature_wanderer. The website is naturewanderer.org. So find those two, and you can instant message me at any time through there, or email me through there. Also, if you want to learn more about nature and support the podcast, join the Patreon. My Patreon will give you extras, including videos, bonus podcasts. I'm starting to get some programs on there, little programs. There's a free one right now on how to have a green Christmas, so be sure to check that out. Also, we have a new store on the website. There's a link. If you click on store, you can get a lot of really good merchandise. There's t-shirts, long sleeve shirts, sweatshirts. We have other things like duffel bags, canvas bags for when you go shopping. So be sure to get those. They have the Nature Wander logo on them so you can show everyone your support for nature and your support for the podcast. So have a great week and keep exploring the nature around you.